The metal walls were already too hot to touch when Samuel first heard the strange breathing. It wasn't normal breathing. It was the kind that comes when bodies fight for oxygen that isn't there. In the darkness of the container, he couldn't see who was making the sound, but he knew what it meant. Someone was dying. The Arizona sun had turned their supposed sanctuary into an oven, and the 10 people locked inside were slowly cooking alive. Just 3 days ago, everything had seemed so promising. Samuel had connected with the guide through a Facebook group for Ecuadorians seeking work in America. The profile looked legitimate. Photos of successful crossings, testimonials from people who'd made it safely, reasonable prices compared to other coyotes. The guide, who called himself Marco, had over 1,000 followers and regularly posted updates about American job opportunities. The plan had sounded professional when Marco explained it through WhatsApp voice messages. Samuel would take a bus from Ecuador to northern Mexico, meet the group in Agua Prieta, then make a 3-night desert crossing into Arizona. Marco's team would provide water, GPS navigation, and most importantly, safe transportation once they reached American soil. $10,000 for guaranteed delivery to Phoenix. Expensive but supposedly worth it for the security. Samuel had scraped together the money by selling his taxi in Quito, borrowing from relatives, and taking loans he'd repay from American wages. At 26, he was young enough to handle the physical demands, but old enough to understand the risks. Or so he thought. Nothing in Marco's cheerful social media posts had prepared him for what actually waited in the desert. The bus journey north had taken 5 days, passing through Colombia, Central America, and into Mexico. At each border, Samuel had paid the bribes Marco had budgeted for, following instructions sent through encrypted messages. Other migrants on the buses shared stories of their own guides and routes. Everyone seemed to have found their coyotes online now. The digital age had transformed human smuggling into e-commerce. In Agua Prieta, Samuel met the other 9 people who'd be crossing with him. There was Elena, a nurse from his own city of Quito. The Gutierrez brothers from Peru, hoping to join their father in Atlanta, a Honduran family of 4, parents with 2 teenage daughters. And Miguel, a Venezuelan engineer whose country's collapse had driven him to desperate measures. They were all educated, middle-class people who'd never imagined they'd be sneaking across borders. The local guide who met them wasn't Marco. That should have been the first warning sign. This man, introducing himself as Raul, claimed Marco coordinated from Phoenix, but didn't make the dangerous border runs himself. It made sense at the time. Why would the organizer risk capture? Raul seemed competent enough, checking their supplies, distributing camouflage clothing, explaining the route with military precision. They set out at dusk, when the February desert was cooling from brutal to merely harsh. Each person carried 3 gallons of water, energy bars, and electrolyte packets. Raul led with a confidence that suggested he'd made this journey dozens of times. He knew where border patrol sensors were located, which paths avoided detection, where natural formations provided cover. The first night was almost exhilarating. They covered 15 miles under a canopy of stars brighter than anything Samuel had seen in Quito's urban glow. The group stayed close together, helping each other over rough terrain, sharing quiet encouragement. When dawn approached, Raul led them to a cluster of rocks where they'd spend the daylight hours hidden under camouflage tarps. Sleep came in fragments during the scorching day. The February sun was weaker than summer, but still dangerous for people hiding without shade. They rationed water carefully, ate sparingly, and waited for darkness. Elena, the nurse, moved among them checking for signs of dehydration. The Honduran mother sang softly to keep her daughters calm. These small kindnesses built bonds that would soon be tested beyond breaking. The second night was harder. Blisters had formed and burst. Water supplies were depleting faster than planned. The Venezuelan engineer, Miguel, was struggling with the pace, but Raul pushed them forward relentlessly. They had to reach specific coordinates by dawn or risk detection. Border Patrol knew the patterns, he explained. Staying on schedule was survival. During the second day of hiding, doubts began creeping in. Raul spent long periods on his phone, texting constantly despite claiming they needed to preserve battery power. When asked about pickup arrangements, his answers became vague. Marco would handle everything once they crossed, he insisted. Trust the plan. But trust was becoming a luxury they couldn't afford. The third night's march felt endless. The Honduran father was now carrying his younger daughter, her feet too damaged to walk. One of the Peruvian brothers had developed severe stomach cramps from contaminated water. The group's cohesion was fracturing under physical stress. But Raul kept promising they were close. Just a few more hours, Phoenix was waiting. When they finally crossed into Arizona, Raul checking his GPS and announcing they'd made it. The relief was overwhelming. People cried, embraced, thanked God and each other. They'd survived the desert. America stretched before them in the pre-dawn darkness. Soon they'd be in Phoenix, taking showers, calling families, beginning their new lives. The white pickup truck appeared exactly where Raul had promised, its headlights cutting through the morning twilight. The driver, a young Mexican-American who spoke perfect English, told him to climb in the back quickly. Border Patrol conducted sweeps at sunrise. They needed to move fast. Everyone scrambled into the truck bed, exhausted bodies pressed together. But nobody complained. They were safe now. The drive started normally enough, following dirt roads away from the border. But after an hour, Samuel noticed they weren't heading toward any city lights. The landscape remained empty desert, becoming more desolate rather than more populated. When he questioned the driver through the rear window, the man said they were taking a safer route to avoid checkpoints. 2 hours into the drive, with the sun now fully up and beating down on them in an exposed truck bed, they pulled into what looked like an abandoned industrial site. Old machinery rusted among the cacti. A few dilapidated buildings stood empty, and there, sitting like a metal monument to abandoned commerce, was a shipping container. The driver told them this was just a temporary stop. They needed to wait here while arrangements were made in Phoenix. The container would keep them hidden from Border Patrol helicopters. Just a few hours, he promised. Marco's team would come get them soon. There was water inside, some food, buckets for necessities. Think of it as a safe house, just less comfortable. Exhausted from 3 nights of walking, the group had little energy to resist. The container's doors swung open to reveal a space maybe 8 feet wide and 20 feet long. Some water jugs sat in one corner. The floor was bare metal. No windows, no ventilation except the gap under the doors. It looked like what it was, a metal box designed for cargo, not humans. One by one, they climbed inside. The Honduran mother hesitated, clutching her daughters, some primal instinct warning against entering the trap. But where else could they go? They were in the middle of nowhere, exhausted, dehydrated, with no idea which direction led to safety. The driver was already getting impatient, eager to leave. The moment everyone was inside, the dynamic changed. The driver's demeanor shifted from helpful to hostile. He demanded their phones, claiming it was for their own safety. Border Patrol could track cell signals. When Miguel the engineer protested, the driver pulled a gun. The message was clear. They were no longer customers but cargo. The phones were collected in a bag. The driver made a call to someone, speaking in code about packages delivered and waiting for pickup instructions. Then he slammed the container doors shut. The sound of a padlock clicking into place was the sound of their American dream becoming a nightmare. Darkness engulfed them completely. The Arizona morning sun had already been heating the metal box, and with 10 bodies inside and no ventilation, the temperature began climbing immediately. People stumbled over each other trying to find comfortable positions in the blackness. Children were crying. Adults were trying not to panic. Elena, the nurse, took charge of professional calm. She organized them to maximize air circulation, had everyone sit along the walls to leave the center clear. She rationed the water strictly. They had no idea how long they'd be here. Her voice in the darkness became an anchor to sanity as the heat continued building. Hours passed with no concept of time. The metal walls went from warm to hot to untouchable. Sweat poured from bodies that had no moisture to spare after 3 days in the desert. The air grew thick, heavy, harder to breathe with each passing hour. What had been discomfort became suffering, then something approaching torture. The Honduran girls were the first to show serious distress. They'd been struggling throughout the desert crossing, and now the heat was overwhelming their smaller bodies. Their mother held them, singing the same song she'd used to comfort them during the journey, but her voice was weakening too. Elena moved between people, checking pulses, sharing the precious water, trying to keep everyone conscious. By what must have been afternoon, though time had no meaning in the darkness, people were stripping off clothes, pressing their bodies against the slightly cooler floor, gasping for air that seemed to contain no oxygen. The bucket in the corner had overflowed, adding the stench of human waste to the already unbreathable atmosphere. Miguel, the engineer, kept trying to find weak spots in the container walls, places where they might force an opening. But it was solid steel, designed to withstand ocean voyages and rough handling. Their prison was perfectly engineered for its original purpose, keeping cargo secure. The fact that the cargo was now human was irrelevant to the metal box. That's when they heard the strange breathing that would haunt Samuel forever. One of the Peruvian brothers, the one who'd been sick during the crossing, had stopped responding to his brother's calls. His breathing had changed to a rattling gasp. Elena crawled over in the darkness, felt for his pulse, tried to help, but without medical supplies, without even light to see, she could only hold his hand as his body shut down. The death changed everything. The theoretical danger became immediate reality. They weren't just trapped, they were dying. People began pounding on the walls, screaming for help, using their last energy in desperate attempts to attract attention. But who would hear them in this abandoned place? The driver was long gone, and Marco, if that was even his real name, had never intended to collect them. It was a younger Honduran daughter who remembered she'd hidden an old phone in her sock. Her parents had told her to leave all electronics, but she wanted to keep her music and photos. It was ancient, barely functional, but when she whispered about it to her mother, a spark of hope ignited in the darkness. The phone had no service, no way to call for help directly. But Samuel remembered something from his taxi driving days. Even without service, phones could sometimes send emergency texts using any available network. It was designed for disasters, and this certainly qualified. In the darkness, hands shaking from heat and fear, he typed a message to 911. 10 people trapped in shipping container. GPS coordinates unknown. Near Tucson maybe. Please help. People dying. He had no idea if it would work, if anyone would receive it, if they believe it wasn't a prank. But he sent it repeatedly, draining the phone's battery, their last connection to the outside world. Each message was a prayer launched into digital space, hoping someone, somewhere would answer. The second death came quieter than the first. The older Honduran daughter simply stopped responding to her mother's increasingly frantic calls. The heat had taken her while she slept, a mercy compared to conscious suffering. Her mother's keening filled the container, a sound of grief so pure it transcended language. The father could only hold his remaining family, unable to protect them from the invisible killer surrounding them. Time became meaningless in the darkness. People drifted in and out of consciousness. Elena continued her rounds, but her professional assessments were growing grimmer. Without water, they'd finished the last drops hours ago. Their bodies were shutting down. She estimated they had hours, not days, before the heat claimed them all. Samuel dozed and woke to find himself unsure what was real and what was hallucination. He saw his taxi back in Quito, saw his grandmother who died years ago, saw snow falling inside the container. The mind created its own reality. When the actual one became unbearable, around him, others were lost in their own heat-driven dreams. The pounding on the door barely registered at first. It seemed like another hallucination, another cruel trick of a dying mind. But it continued, grew louder, and then impossibly, the padlock rattled. Real sounds, real voices, English and Spanish mixed, shouting about emergency services, asking if anyone was alive inside. When the doors finally swung open and daylight flooded in, it was like being born into a world of pain and possibility. The heat rushed out, replaced by marginally cooler desert air that felt like Arctic wind. Paramedics swarmed in, checking bodies, starting IVs, carrying out those who couldn't walk. Of the 10 who'd entered the container, 4 were still alive. Samuel, Elena the nurse, Miguel the engineer, the Honduran mother, though she retreated so far into shock that she didn't respond to her own name. The others had succumbed to heat and dehydration, their American dreams ending in a metal box in the Arizona desert. The rescue made headlines briefly. Migrants found in an abandoned container competed with other tragedies for public attention. The investigation revealed that Marco's entire operation was a scam. The Facebook profile was fake, the testimonials fabricated. He collected money from desperate people, delivered them to the desert, and left them to die. The container had been used before. Investigators found evidence of previous victims. Samuel spent weeks recovering in the hospital, his body slowly remembering how to regulate temperature, how to process food and water normally. The psychological recovery would take much longer. He'd survived by pure chance. If the Honduran girl hadn't hidden that phone, if the emergency text system hadn't worked, if the dispatcher hadn't taken the message seriously, they'd all be dead. The legal aftermath was complex. As survivors of human trafficking, they were eligible for special visas. But the process was slow, complicated by their legal entry. Samuel found himself in limbo, alive but not living, in America but not American, free but not free to leave or truly stay. Elena threw herself into advocacy work, using her medical knowledge to educate others about the dangers of desert crossings and container traps. She'd kept everyone alive as long as possible in that metal box, and now she was determined to prevent others from needing such desperate care. Miguel returned to Venezuela despite everything. The container had broken something in him that even his country's collapse hadn't touched. He'd rather face political persecution than another moment in enclosed spaces. His engineering mind couldn't stop calculating the thermodynamics of their near-death, the precise mathematics of how close they had come to extinction. The Honduran mother was reunited with extended family in Los Angeles, but she never spoke again. The trauma of losing her daughters in that container had stolen her voice as surely as the heat had stolen their lives. She communicated through gestures and writing, her silence a monument to grief too large for words. Samuel eventually found work in construction, building houses for people who'd never know how he'd arrived in America. Every enclosed space triggered memories of the container. Elevators were impossible. Even rooms with closed doors caused panic. He slept outside when possible, needing to see stars to believe he wasn't trapped. The physical scars faded. The dehydration damage, the heat blisters, the raw throat from screaming. But phantom sensations remained. Sometimes he'd feel the container's heat on his skin during cool evenings. He'd taste metal in his mouth when stressed. His body remembered what his mind tried to forget. He sent money home to Ecuador, but couldn't explain to his family what he'd endured. How could he describe the sound of people dying in darkness? The weight of survivors' guilt? The randomness of who lived and who didn't? He told them the crossing was hard, but he'd made it. Truth and lies mixed like the English and Spanish in his daily life. Dating was impossible. How could he explain why he needed windows open? Why he checked exits obsessively? Why certain breathing sounds made him freeze? He'd survived the container, but remained imprisoned by its memory. Freedom, he learned, was more than just being outside metal walls. The Facebook group where he'd found Marco was shut down, but others sprouted immediately. Desert crossings continued. Containers kept claiming victims. The mathematics of desperation ensured a steady supply of people willing to risk everything for a chance at something better. Samuel wanted to warn them all, but knew his words would carry no weight against hope. 3 years later, he still thought about the ones who didn't make it. The Peruvian brothers who dreamed of Atlanta, the Honduran sisters who'd never see America beyond that metal box, the father who'd carried his daughter through the desert only to watch her die in darkness. They haunted his successful American life, reminding him that survival was random, not earned. On the anniversary each year, he'd drive out to the desert, though he could never find the exact spot where the container had been. It had been removed as evidence, then presumably scrapped or returned to service. Somewhere, cargo was being shipped in the box where people had died. The thought both horrified and comforted him. Life moving forward, commerce continuing, the world forgetting what he couldn't. He met other survivors at support groups, people who'd been trapped in trucks, houses, containers. They shared a specific understanding of how freedom could become imprisonment, how rescue could feel like another kind of death. They'd survived their boxes but carried them forward, invisible prisons that traveled wherever they went. The guide role was never caught. He delivered his human cargo as contracted and disappeared back into the network that profited from desperation. New guides took his place, leading new groups through the same desert paths to new containers, new traps, new tragedies that would briefly make headlines before being forgotten. Samuel learned that trauma wasn't a moment, but a companion. It sat with him at construction sites, whispered during quiet evenings, screamed during nightmares where container doors never opened. He'd walked 3 nights through the desert for freedom and found a different kind of prison, one made of memory rather than metal. But he was alive. When the weight became unbearable, he'd remember Elena checking pulses in the darkness, the Honduran mother singing to her daughters, Miguel searching for weak spots in solid steel. They'd faced death together, and some had faced it down. That bond, forged in darkness and heat, was stronger than the trauma that tried to break it. The container had taken 6 lives and left 4 to carry the memory. Samuel carried it through American days that the dead would never see, building houses they'd never inhabit, sending money home from jobs they'd never work. He was their monument now, their survival consolidated into his single beating heart. Sometimes tourists would ask him about his journey to America, expecting colorful stories of adventure and triumph. He'd mention the desert crossing, leaving out the container, the deaths, the phone that saved some but not all. Let them keep their romantic notions of immigration. The truth was locked away like they'd been locked in metal, too hot to touch, too heavy to share. The desert still called to desperate people, and containers still waited to trap them. Samuel couldn't stop the cycle, could only survive his part in it. He walked 3 nights for freedom and found that freedom could be its own prison, that survival could be its own punishment, that some doors, once opened, could never really close. But in the morning, he'd rise and build again, constructing America one house at a time, carrying the dead in his heart and the living in his hope that someday, somehow, the containers would stand empty and the desert paths would lead where they promised, to safety, to freedom, to lives worth more than the metal boxes that tried to contain them.